Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for having me here. I'm very excited to have the opportunity to engage with my fellow nerd tribe. So look forward to learning from you today as much as learning from our discussions in the small groups and the poster sessions as well. So I thought a lot about today's presentation because you don't often get the opportunity to reflect on 10 years of learning. So, I'll do my best to share what I've gathered over the decade of work in this sector and even beyond that. So, are we okay with the slides? We think so. We'll just take a short tech break. All right. So I too wanted to acknowledge the First Nations here and walked in during the prayer, so I appreciated the words and the time to reflect as we get into this work. Next. I actually wanted to start with a little bit about me. As any good researcher would do, it's important to reflect on our position and the biases that we bring into this work as well. So the reason I wanted to take a pause and do that is because my background and my life experiences have influenced the way I've engaged in this sector. And as I share with you how I've come to this place in my research, you'll see that my background was hugely influential in the types of research I undertook and the types of positions in this work I've ended up working in. It's not a belaboring life history, but I'll just highlight a couple of things. One, that I was born and raised in communist Romania. And in 1989, when the communist revolution to overthrow Ceausescu occurred, I was actually in primary school. And during that time, there was a major break in our social fabric, of course, and major shift from communist regime into chaos, essentially, at the time. So what that does to a kid is it tells them that everything is questionable, and what you assume to be the normal world can overnight be completely uprooted as well. So a pretty major life experience, and not just me, but other folks I'm sure can attest to. And whether you're an immigrant or not, there's definitely periods in your life that might be recalled upon as that major break in terms of what you expected reality to be. From there, my family fled to Germany, and we lived in what was called an asylum seeker camp. So an asylum, and it's very similar and recalls what's happening with the Syrian refugees. There was a massive flood during that period of folks from all over the Eastern Bloc. So as soon as there was a little bit of chaos in the state's ability to control population and migrations, there was a massive influx into the West. So we're seeing that again today like I mentioned, the Syrian situation. So we lived I want to say a camp, but it wasn't a camp. It was an abandoned cloister that was refashioned into a refugee shelter. And we lived there for 2 years while we tried to figure out where to go next. So again, you can see why I'm interested in the topic, of course. From there, ended up to be sponsored refugees to Canada. And there we have some major jumps all over the country. So from Toronto, Penticton, Prince George, Edmonton. Obviously, this is not unique to other immigrants as well, where you're trying to find your place in Canadian society. You try to adjust, acculturate. And then this is also the point where certain things happen in my family personally that, again, brought this issue of homelessness into our lives. So my brother started becoming involved with gangs in Prince George and actually never ended up finishing grade 9. He's been in jail since. So this is a point where my family ruptured, and I stayed on the so-called good path and, became a doctor and became this expert in the field. But you can see like that my family's experience is exactly why drew me to this work. I was trying to understand what is it about me versus Alex that put us on these very, very different paths in our lives. And that, of course, led me to different research questions to probe that. So when it was time for me to go to university, I loved cultural anthropology, and I took 101s at U of A in everything, and anthropology was the one that was like, yeah, this makes sense. Why? Because it put everything in the global perspective. It put everything in this ability to question and be critical about our assumptions, and that made a lot of sense given where I was coming from. However, the path there was to look at social movements and religion, nationalism. So what is it about these massive breaks in the social fabric, and how does a society gain traction in social movement? So I studied that issue from a global perspective and theoretical perspective. But while I was doing that, I worked at Boyle Street Co-op. So anybody here from Boyle Street Co-op? No? Okay. Well, I'm probably going to mess up what they do today, but back then it was very much a drop-in center with services that were wraparound and had the very, very little in the way of housing that we have today, but certainly did a lot of street-level outreach, et cetera. And then I also worked at the Multicultural Health Brokers Co-op. So I did ethnocultural community engagement and work on foreign-trained professionals. So and actually, I see Michael Fair. He was actually one of the keynote speakers back then on some of the work we were doing to raise up leaders in the ethnocultural community as well. And then, of course, I had a degree and I had to get a job. So off like everybody else, we went to Calgary, myself and my then husband, not then husband, became husband. He's still my husband. He was my partner forever, right? We actually met in Prince George. And actually, that's a really on point that I should probably mention. The reason we ended up at U of A together is in Prince George, while Alex went his way into gang life, and which he's still part of, ended up in this really horrible situation where my parents started turning on each other. And my dad became an active, he was pretty active in his alcoholism throughout his life, but he became really quite out of control in that period. And my mom left him. But of course, I was still in that house with him. So I went into the child welfare office in Prince George and said, this is not a good situation. I just want to finish high school and I want to get out of here. And of course, child welfare, like we are all familiar, told me to reunite and go back into that situation. And so I had to. But luckily, my dad discovered the internet and decided to find himself another wife in Romania. So he went ahead and did that. And my boyfriend, Travis, at the time, said, this doesn't make any sense. So he actually went on my behalf, so the little woman saved by the man, to the same child welfare office, and he argued for me to get independent status and independent support. So I was able to receive that social assistance and found myself a basement suite and finish high school, right? And that's how I ended up at U of A, that I was able to get finally some student assistance. There were so many stupid policy barriers along the way that we could belabor. My point is that all of these patterns or all of these experiences led me to the kinds of questions I engaged with in research and the kind of job positions I ended up having. So when I did get into the career world, my first gig was in Calgary, was at the United Way, and there my work was around public policy. So while I had some experience from a practice perspective and in a lived experience perspective, I had no idea how money decisions were made. I had no idea what a system of care might be, what the role of these big funders and decision makers, what role that had in shaping the experiences I had previously. So that was extremely illuminating for me. And then from there, it was exactly this beginning of the 10-year plan. And the Calgary Homeless Foundation recruited me to take on their research portfolio. So I had very much a research background, pretty strictly research background. But from there, I realized, damn, like all this learning I've done and for all this lived experience and understanding I have, I can write a policy brief for the life of me. So those years were really about building my capacity to understand how to influence government policy and how to leverage the research world to do that work more effectively. At the same time, I also started getting more and more of a responsibility in that organization to make decisions about funding. So whereas I started off as the independent kind of research academic that was now becoming more involved in shaping practice and policy because I was able to leverage evidence-based practice and make an argument for housing first, now I was actually I should say I was very ambitious. I wanted to take over. Like, I wanted to have control over the money internally because I felt that it wasn't being allocated from the evidence base. But I was, in some ways new to that space as well. So when I became in charge of making the funding allocations, I was thrown in the politics of it all. So not just, it's the small p politics, of course, the relationships with funded agencies, the tensions, the push and pull that you have, the hate sometimes that people have when somebody that might have a higher level of control over their daily life is making decisions they don't like. So extremely illuminating from that perspective that what we think is evidence-based actually has these tremendous negative consequences in practice as well. You see that firsthand. So when the plan to end homelessness in Calgary started to gain traction, there was considerable tension in our community. And I'll speak about Calgary, but there's, I'm sure you can relate to it in Edmonton as well, because you have a new way of doing business and you have new players that might have not been there before telling you what's best. And that might not necessarily align with what's happening on the ground that you know from practice, but you might not have the research or the cost-benefit analysis to make that argument otherwise. So I'm not sure if that resonates with you, but in Calgary, we certainly have had tremendous learnings about the tensions involved in this systems change work. And then in 2012, I had a baby, and I couldn't work the 60 hours a week, so I went into consulting, and I also wanted to learn from what was happening in other places in our country, because in some ways we become very, very stuck in our locality in this work. So we think we're doing some innovative work. We might be. In fact, we might be light years ahead. But if we're not looking elsewhere, it's really difficult to have that comparative perspective. So going back to my anthropological hat, the comparative perspective, the participant observation work became much more front and center for my consulting practice. And that's also where I started work at the School of Public Policy. And if you know anything about the School of Public Policy, it's what us in maybe the liberal arts would call a neoliberal institution. So as much as we, I love my department and my colleagues there. They're very much Ted Morton is a fellow there as well. So there was some major kind of soul searching I had to do if I'm going to get into this department that is known for its cost analysis of everything and this rational economics approach. Then what does that mean for the way I think about social issues and human rights, et cetera, if everything is boiled down to money and economics. And I've had some major insights from my experience there and have fundamentally rethought the way I think about some of the research questions and the assumptions I've had over the time, and have to give credit where credit's due. But I have also been able to influence the kinds of research that they do there. So that multidisciplinary work and working with your natural enemy on campus, they don't think of the liberal sciences that way, and there's certainly openness to cross-fertilization if there's relationship and trust. So I've benefited tremendously from that experience. And then most recently have become much more engaged in the tech space and the impact of technological transformation on social systems as well. So even started my own app, so very much into the private sector, startup and scaling of social enterprises. Like, that has been a whole nother education. So, having said all these, I wanted to give you this overview of my background, because everything I've come up with and my insights are obviously very filtered through this lens. And so I would think about, you and today's conversations, like what is it that has shaped your experiences, and what are the pros and cons of that, and just being aware of it. So through that, and again, I thought I would share my aha/does. They might be duh to you, they might be obvious, but for me, they were ahas, and I'll give you some examples of what I mean by all of these in the rest of the presentation. So my first insight and learning through these 10 plus years really has been to seek to be proven fundamentally wrong. So some of the assumptions we bring to this work, like even the notions about how social structures work and how homelessness is created as a result of social structures, sometimes those theories that we buy into in our various fields can be proven fundamentally wrong, and we have to be open to that. If we're stuck in our paradigm, we're going to get the same results. And the only way to do that is, of course, to expose yourself to different perspectives. If I'm only hanging out with people from Romania that were immigrants that ended up on this path, then of course we're going to have very similar experiences. And if you're not connecting with colleagues from very different disciplines and having those debates and being open to be wrong, right? That's a very, actually for me, it's a hard thing to do, to be wrong. So that's been a major learning. The other piece is to look to the distant past and the distant future. And that's, again, something I found in my work at the practice policy level, is it's the tyranny of the urgent. Right? So everything is about making decisions quick, and we're rewarded in some ways to be agile, right? To be quick on the draw and have the evidence right there and make that decision, that we lose sight of how that fits in the longue durée, right? So the distant past, and what do we have to learn from that, and obviously looking very far into the future. So we don't take pause to do that very much in this work, and it's essential. And I'll give you some examples of that later in the presentation. And then the last one is to take an ant's and bird's eye view. So the micro and the macro. So, and oftentimes we put ourselves in the, well, I'm up here, right? I'm a funder, I'm a policymaker, I don't get into the weeds. Or I'm practice and I'm frontline, so that's for academics to worry about. When really the magic is us going back and forth in that lens, and obviously across all these lenses. So these might be obvious to you. These are things I've learned. So through blood, sweat, tears, and laughs as well. On the plan implementation as well, I'm thinking and reflecting back on my research colleagues and our early learnings on the developing a research agenda. This ability to coordinate and deepen research capabilities has been absolutely instrumental in plan implementation, and I think you're obviously here to as a testament to that. And the realization that good evidence-based decisions require good research and require work that's constantly testing and retesting, and I heard the words prototyping already this morning, so I feel like I don't need to belabor this. But the role of research in ending homelessness, preventing and ending homelessness has been instrumental in Edmonton, Calgary, and the rest of Alberta. It's in a way baked into plan rollout. But I would challenge you today to also think about how your research also challenges fundamental assumptions in that work. Because if you as researchers don't do that, the day-to-day practitioners, they don't have the luxury to sit back and ask the big questions and challenge those fundamental assumptions. And the reason why that's important is because, of course, it has a direct impact on operations and on how we structure our systems. So we don't want to inadvertently create new negative feedback loops by drinking our own Kool-Aid. So I would say in your work, ensuring that moving forward, yes, we're supporting the work, but we're also asking, doing the critical analysis on our work. So anybody tell me how much time I have left? You're half an hour, perfect. So the other piece I wanted to give you a bit of background about, and again, from Alina's lens, might not be your lens, looking at this work and 10 years back in ending homelessness, there's certain patterns and learnings where research has been quite instrumental, but in different ways. So of course, we're nearing the end of Edmonton's initial 10 years. I think we have, Susan, do we have 2 more years of the plan? 0.5? Did she say 0.5? So very much a pressing deadline there. But these are learnings that I saw happening in other communities across Alberta as well. So the reason I highlight this is because, like I said, research has had a tremendous impact throughout, but it has also had a different role throughout as well. So in the initial phase of the plans, and in Edmonton it was, if you recall, it would have been the good times from an economic perspective, but that was the startup phase. So that's when there was such excitement about housing first. Folks were experimenting with new program models. There was new dollars coming into the system, and an emergent homeward trust at the time that was starting to coordinate those interventions in very different ways than previously. So that startup phase required research to demonstrate that there was indeed an evidence base to which we could put the new dollars to use. So how we design programs and the types of tailoring that we did for Edmonton's plan would have been strongly informed by the research community and the work that you do locally. And during that phase, there was also considerations around special populations. So realizing that Indigenous people with lived experience needed different interventions, or youth needed different interventions, those issues started to emerge, and that was a research and lived experience practical aspect. So while we might want to inherently do this, just housing first everyone, there was a lens, a critical lens during that time to say, actually, it's not going to be the same for everyone, and the outcomes are not going to be the same for everyone. So we need to be really strategic in how we tailor programs to have the best impact. So I think that was a major contribution during that startup phase from the research community. The next phase, which as the scaling occurred and as more evidence came up around success, the data implementation became even more important. So you now had years of information coming out of those programs telling you what was working, what wasn't working, and realization that perhaps there's more that we need to be looking at other than just implementing programs. So that's when we start talking about what our sector calls system planning. So what exactly is this homeless serving sector? And if you recall going back at that time, we actually didn't talk about that. There wasn't a homeless serving sector or homeless serving system of care. It was agencies doing work. So articulating that there is a system and articulating what the roles of different parts of the system are in the greater whole, and recognizing that we needed somebody to actually coordinate that and develop ways for us to engage with each other and coordinate practice and coordinate policy, coordinate research. That became the impetus for a much more enhanced focus on system planning locally as well. So that's, again, when you would have seen research contribute to this, to say, well, what are examples around system planning in other sectors that we can borrow from? So we looked at the education, the health system, maybe not that great of examples, but there's learnings that we had to develop our approach here. And that's also the time when the data collection and data integration became essential, because we had to develop indicators to monitor the health of the system, and also started asking some pretty hard questions around, well, you know, here we are rehousing folks, but there's still more coming. So what's happening in the greater ecosystem of Edmonton that are key drivers into this? And of course, not new questions, but they have a different flavor when you're in the trenches trying to resolve these issues and demonstrate impact to politicians and funders that have invested in this initiative. And then the last phase, which is in a way where we're still currently at, is this one around systems integration. So the systems integration phase is really about recognizing where the homeless serving system begins and ends. So from a client perspective, where does the Housing First workers' accountabilities for that person begin and end, and what are those accountabilities, and where do other systems come in, right? So we have the poverty reduction and social supports, we have the health, education, corrections, et cetera. We have other systems at play that intersect with the homeless serving system. And, you know, let's be honest, those actual lines are extremely blurry, and sometimes the same agency can play in all of these systems simultaneously in practice. So recognizing those interdependencies and the limits of our homeless serving system has been a notable insight that came again from that research lens on the data, asking the hard questions in terms of, you know, if we're housing everyone, where are they coming back? Where are they coming back after they've been stable for 2, 3, 4, 5 years? And is that our fault? Did Housing First fail? Or is there something else happening in the broader environment that we're missing? And it's asking those questions and finding the answers to those questions is going to be essential to the long-term sustainability of this work. So it leads us to the system root causes, of course, which we all know it's not, homeless serving system is not going to end homelessness on its own, and the root causes reach much deeper than you know, somebody's has an eviction notice. So things like addictions, mental health, in relation to a systems integration approach have become major topics and major foci in the work of Homeward Trust as the system planner, but I would say have been there from the beginning for the client perspective, obviously, and for the frontline folks that are having to cobble together resources to achieve sustainable outcomes for the clients they serve. So I would say this is the path in a way of plan, rollout, learnings, and the role of research in particular. And of course, you know, you see the end of the road, and it's not the end of the road, it's what's around the corner is the question. So again, as you work through your learnings today, thinking about the what's next, what we've learned, and what's next will be essential, and what can research contribute to that conversation. If you don't know what the homeless serving system in Edmonton is, here's a picture that Susan and I belabored for many good months last year to try to articulate what the different program types in the homeless serving system in Edmonton is. And you can see there a range of services with coordinated access, diversion, and supported referrals. I hope you are all familiar with this. If you're not, then again, ask Jared, because he'll know. But you see there where the blue and yellow intersect, the other systems of care that intersect. And while we're really, really good and have honed in on what this homeless serving system of care looks like for Edmonton, and we have data to actually track and measure and course correct, we are blind to the yellow. We have no idea what that looks like. We don't know what the flow of clients is. We don't know what's working over there and what's keeping clients sustainably housed and quality of life-wise, what outcomes there might be. And we haven't really done a good job of articulating how the homeless serving system works with these other systems. And this is not because that might not exist in those systems, right? So those systems probably know what their best practices are and what their goals are, but what if those goals and outcomes don't align with ours, right? What if we're doing something unintentionally in one system and creating pressure points in other ones? And so those are some of the questions that we're struggling with as we come to the conclusions of plans to end homelessness. And Edmonton and Calgary are in some ways at the front end of the last year of their 10-year plans. And the big learnings have been that, yeah, we can squeeze water from a stone and make this system extremely efficient and effective, but unless those other systems plug in the right way, we're continuously having to bail this sinking canoe. So this issue of prevention has emerged as a major topic of discussion and trying to figure out, again, where does the Housing First program do the handoff to community supports or community resources and vice versa. So again, some learnings from our local perspective to consider. I feel like I mentioned this a little bit already, but some of the significant learnings that have been supported by research in the past 10 years have really reconfirmed this need to focus on a person-centered approach in Housing First. So it's not just about housing, it's about supports as well. Believe it or not, that was a learning. So of course, it's not just about pumping people into housing. Like, of course, they're going to fail if we don't give them the right supports to maintain that housing and wrap those supports around them. So the person-centered approach to Housing First and how we do that really well and effectively and build trust and relationships at that frontline level has been a key learning. The recognition of chronicity and its impacts on shelter use through coordinated access, HMIS, and the by names list. Again, if you don't know what these things are, ask Jared. But essentially, learning that if we're just housing without paying attention to what's happening in our shelter system, we might not necessarily get the system level outcomes we're looking to achieve. So if we're not paying attention to people that might be stuck in the shelter system and creating not a highway, but a clear link and a referral link into our Housing First programs, we might not relieve some of the pressures on our emergency crisis response. That was a learning, right? Indigenous partnerships built and nurtured, and again, I think Edmonton is actually on the leading edge in the relationships and partnerships you've built with Indigenous leaders and communities here. Other communities come to learn from you, but partnerships like you have with Blue Quills and bringing that trauma-informed and intergenerational trauma aspect to the way programs are delivered is something that's actually leading edge in relation to the rest of the country. So it's kudos to you, and of course in this time of reconciliation, we're looking to you to lead that work to the next level as well. The housing capacity increases we've had, of course, have been fundamentally influenced by our ability to make a case that housing is going to be needed as well. So affordable housing in general, supportive housing as well. So of course, that crisis is still at play, but we've certainly seen more investment from provincial and now national housing strategy. That again, Edmonton was part of a movement that looked at the evidence and made the numbers connect with the ask of the province and the feds to make this happen. I would say if it wasn't for the success that we saw in cities like Edmonton and your Alberta colleagues, we probably wouldn't have a national housing strategy. It was absolutely fundamental to show that it is possible to make a significant impact on the issue. The provincial uncertainties and budgetary constraints are, however, making it tougher to make the case, and I think folks are getting used to the cost savings argument. So from the research perspective, while we leaned on you to help us make that business case to politicians over time, that message is now run of the mill, right? So, oh yes, housing first, it's cost savings, whatever. Show me that where the money is. And they'll say, like, because I don't see the money. So one learning and consideration for you is how do we help make the case for this, especially during this time of provincial uncertainty around the future of our social policy approach in Alberta, where is there opportunity to enhance our case for support without leaning on what has worked in the past, because that might not work in the future either. The sophisticated approach to system planning, KPIs, dashboards, evidence-based funding decisions, you heard a little bit about that already from me and Jared as well. That's, again, something that we've been able to achieve in the homeless serving system, but that's not necessarily where everybody else is at. And there's an unintended consequence to that type of approach at the frontline level as well. So I will say that while it has been something that's made Edmonton avant-garde, paying attention to what's happening at the front line, the client-case manager relationship, and what's happening there is something that, again, research in that critical perspective is going to be really important for us to keep in mind. Because what might also occur is, and again, I'm not going to tell you anything you don't know, but the very logical gaming behavior that would ensure that you score high to get access to housing, so leveraging your knowledge to be able to get access to supports and gaming, so-called, we call it gaming, but it's very normal and behavior that we practice in our day-to-day lives too as well. That is likely occurring. I know for certain it's happening in Calgary because I've done the research to look at the phenomenon, but I would say it's not something unique to Calgary, and it might be happening here. And then the other one, that programs might similarly be feeling the pressure of funding cuts if they don't meet certain KPIs. So then what does that do to their practice, right? And so the day-to-day example might be that an agency is not scoring as high, so the funding is under threat, and one reaction might be to play with the numbers that they plug in the system so that they score higher. So then really the data can be trusted for decision making because the data isn't necessarily reflective of practice. Again, this is not a call out. This is let's be smart about how we roll this stuff out, and let's be smart as researchers to start thinking about how we can support that the system's going in the right direction, and we're flagging these in real time so that we can adjust. We're not waiting 10 years to realize that our data's gone on this path, right? So how are we learning about how these decisions at the system level are impacting that frontline experience between client and an agency? And then of course on the client side, if the word is you have to score this way to get access to that resource, I mean, we're normal people. Of course we're gonna ensure that we score in a particular way. So again, I'm speaking as a researcher that has done work on this issue in Calgary. I'm not saying this is happening in your community, but the reason it's important to keep in mind is, of course, that you want your system to be effective and have the right approach and the right results, and that there's no unintended consequence as well. So that's another piece that has been a significant learning and merits further probing as well. The innovation focus as well, I think that's something we've done extremely well in Alberta, that we're constantly pushing the envelope and constantly saying, well, what's next, what's next? And I just finished an evaluation of a supported referrals program that Homeward Trust has funded as an experiment in a way, an innovation, and it's proven extremely successful from a prevention diversion perspective to keep the folks that are not chronically homeless, that haven't been in the shelter system forever. They might be hidden homeless, but still extremely vulnerable, and with a relatively small amount of investment have been able to keep folks in the community housed, and with significant positive results at the quality of life level. So that type of testing and innovation is part of the culture here, and I would say that's, again, where research is really important. What else are we missing, right? We have a slate of Housing First programs, and we're testing prevention diversion. What else could we be looking at to enhance our impact in the community? And sometimes in the practice policy space, we're, again, under the gun on producing results and reporting and reacting, that we don't have time to luxuriate in from what our perspective might be into what else might be happening in other jurisdictions and what learnings we can bring into Edmonton. And that's, again, where your role is so essential as the research community. And again, that systems integration beast of an issue. How do we link effectively to other public systems when other public systems might not even see themselves as systems? Right? So here we are, we're the homeless serving system, and we'd like to coordinate with you on discharge planning. Okay, thanks. I will take that under consideration. That it hasn't worked to the level we have needed it to work, right? Our funding coordination isn't happening. There's, and again, I'll speak, I haven't done the research in Edmonton, so I'll have to speak for Calgary again. But in our community, we have 5,500 programs and services that are in that nonprofit space that are touching on poverty, mental health, addictions, et cetera. And only 40 of those are Housing First. So, 5,000 versus 40. There's a whole slate of other services that have the mandate to improve wellness, social inclusion, integration of people in the community. It's part of our prevention work, part of the social safety net, but we're really coordinated on those 40 in the homeless serving system, but don't even know what that landscape looks like in our community. So never mind at the practice level being able to know where to refer clients into that broader community and help coordinate that community into a broader safety net. So thank you. I'm getting the 5-minuter. So that's, I would say, is a major part of our work that is still left undone, and where I would think the research community has a tremendous role to play as well. The other research questions I have, and again, I'll speak to these broadly because I only have 5 minutes, but you can see that each of these are a tremendous opportunity for thinking ahead. So bringing it back to my point about thinking micro, but the ant's view and the bird's eye view. Some of these are bird's eye view questions that we don't have the luxury of getting into at the practice policy level. But we know that the workforce is transforming and there's major technological disruption in the social fabric. So what is that going to do to the social fabric over time? We have a 10-year window around plans to end homelessness, but thinking 20 years out, the impacts of digital transformation, what is that going to do to poverty, inequality, experiences of homelessness risk? And are we having those considerations in the back of our minds as we plan our homeless serving system and evaluate how we integrate with other systems? We need your help to figure that out. The next one is the slow economic recovery, and the impacts of that on the at-risk population as well have been obviously palpable. But the other piece around the slow economic recovery is the learning that economic growth, so GDP as an indicator, and population growth are actually most correlated to homelessness growth. So the slow economic recovery believe it or not, has given us a bit of a break. And this is from learnings from 24 different cities in Canada, including Edmonton, that economic recovery creates new issues, absolutely, but it seems to have a stabilizing effect on absolute homelessness. So that type of a learning and what that means moving forward, that homelessness seems to be connected with economic and population growth. What does that mean for public policy, right? That's a new learning that without the data we've generated locally and in other communities, we wouldn't even be able to have that conversation. So that's a big deal. The ongoing poverty and income inequality challenge, and again, connecting this to the transforming workforce as well, has been a tremendous challenge and will continue to be a tremendous research area of interest. Aging population, you'll say duh, but think about the aging population in relation to the homeless sector, because what we now see is longer lifespans in a vulnerable group. And so folks are aging as they should, and their mortality has decreased because of Housing First, so that's what we wanted. But now they're staying longer and longer in our permanent supportive housing and our Housing First programs. And are those units prepared? Are those case managers prepared for that aging workforce? Are we connecting the dots between Housing First and long-term care? Right? So those are some of the questions. We already see it in the point-in-time count that the cohorts are aging. Right? And senior in homeless years is the 50, not the 65-year-old. And there's a huge gap in that population in terms of benefits and access to benefits. So their physicality might be in the senior space, but their income and their access to benefits is not. So what are we doing from a research perspective to hone in on this issue? The ongoing urbanization and migration, was that a two? Two, okay. And this speaks again to the looking far into the future, looking really far back into the past, that second point on my ahas and does. This one's about the realization that as a global community, our cities are going to continue to grow. So our communities are going to continue to become more and more urbanized, and migration is going to be a continuous growth factor in Edmonton as much as the rest of the major urban cities as well. And with urbanization and migration, though the issues around settlement will continue to have a key role to play in how we address homelessness as well. And we see this going back into the far past when we see settling from the hunter-gatherer societies into the agricultural transformation, the industrial revolution, when we see massive disruptions and mass movement of people, we see stratification and inequality as well. So thinking about the transforming workforce, technology disruption, and this ongoing trends towards global cities, what does that mean long-term for this community as well? Reconciliation and the Indigenous population trends. So again, a young urban population, ongoing migration. How are we going to support reconciliation? What does that actually even mean, right? From the lived experience perspective as well, as from the healing side, and how do we integrate that into programming and policy making? Some of us will just admit that we don't really know how to do this well. So asking the questions and doing the work will be essential. The rental markets, homeownership, and core housing needs. So the way housing markets are continuing to leave certain parts of the population behind, and what are the right policy levers to reverse that trend will be, always been and will continue to be a critical issue. The designer drug, legalization of marijuana, and social disorder. So this is something that is increasing as a major issue across Canadian cities, where you have the impacts of fentanyl, methamphetamines, and the behaviors that brings into play at the social or the street level, right? And in shelters, et cetera. Our shelters are not exactly well designed to deal with meth use, for instance, right? So same as how do we rehouse folks with methamphetamine addictions? What is that even going to do to the brain's well-being long-term as people age, right? So the later onset of schizophrenia that's brought about by these new drugs. And these drugs are evolving faster than we can even study them. Right? So it's an extremely innovative sector. So there's more and more coming, and we're not even keeping up with understanding the long-term effects of those. And then the last one, and it's very much connected with this, we've made tremendous strides, and I see that AS PolicyWise is here, so they, Kathy can speak on this much more than I, but understanding trauma, adverse childhood experiences, and the relationship between that and homelessness, we have the research to show that there is tremendous linkages between these factors. And so if we know that, then what does that mean for programming? What does that mean for policy? What does this mean for systems integration with child welfare, education systems, et cetera? So I'll stop there. I will share the presentation slides, of course, and I had so much more, but that's how we are, researchers. So yeah, I guess I'll just bring it back to my key takeaways and my does. And sorry, this would normally be much, much easier if our clicker learned. There we go. So my does: seek to be fundamentally wrong, look to the distant past and future, and take an ant and bird's eye view. So these have been my learnings, and I hope I shared something of my journey in this work that is of value, and look forward to the rest of the day with you. Thanks. Questions, apparently.
We could take, I think, one or two questions and just adjust our schedule a little bit. I do want to say that because we are webcasting today, if you do have a question, if you can throw your hand in the air, and we will speedily bring you a mic so that can make it onto the webcast as well.
Alina, thank you very much for that, shall we say, précis of cultural anthropology as it applies to homelessness. My question for you is about prevention. To me, prevention is key to everything. Yeah. How much, well, are there other jurisdictions where you've seen prevention happen in the course of dealing with a complex social problem, where there's been a turn in a sea change sort of way to prevention?
Well, I wouldn't say there's a sea change anywhere. You see in obviously the Nordic countries that have much more developed social assistance kind of intervention. So where there's less inequality, tends to be less homelessness in general. So and in those countries, it's not that they switched suddenly. They've had long histories of investing in social housing. So their social housing as a percent of the housing markets is significantly higher than Canada's in general. And then the level of inequality is, the Gini coefficient would be much lower, and the types of policies they have in place around income assistance, or the guaranteed income type of argument, that's where you see that. In terms of local prevention examples, don't run me out, but Medicine Hat, again, because they've been, but it truly is going back to this population economic growth issue. If there is a supply-demand aspect to this. If you have this many people in the risk pool, and you have this many resources for housing first, prevention programs, and they're all coordinated, you do reach an equilibrium if there is, no offense to Medicine Hat, but relatively stagnant economic growth, because there's not that drive of people coming in. But that's a really good example of this kind of island approach to experimentation, because all these other factors are relatively stable, and then we can say, okay, how much housing first do we actually need on a per population basis if all these other factors are consistent? to achieve this goal. So what's happening there is that they're now able to, they've kind of optimized their shelter and housing first programs, and now they're getting into those relationships with education, corrections, health, to actually develop, very coordinated ways of identifying people that are getting discharged and intervening early, so they never hit the shelter. They get into housing first at the discharge point. So that's a practical example. And the other one is their prevention work with school systems. So identifying children and youth that might be at risk and wrapping the family with case managed supports to help them get income assistance or counseling, et cetera. But it's not just, the homeless serving system doing that. They've integrated as part of their poverty strategy with FCSS, with United Way, with all of these systems I talked about. Because again, it's a small community and they have resources and they have housing, they have a rental market that is relatively healthy given, the demand that's out there. They're able to come together in a kind of these types of forums to coordinate. Like their whole system, decision makers can fit in this room, not like Edmonton or Calgary. So I'd say that we have great examples of that level of work. It's still, in its infancy and we're learning as we go, but it's proven very effective at optimizing. Now, that community will always, if it starts creating economic growth, that whole thing has to be rethought, right? Because they're going to have new pressures coming in. So the beauty is in creating an approach that is nimble and is able to adjust. And to do that, you need to be really coordinated, and you need to get access to dollars to scale up and down, right? So you're never going to end it, but you can develop a systems response that's really fine-tuned so that you make best use of what you have. So I hope that answers it. Yeah.
One more?
Morning.
Me now?
Yes.
Thank you for an absolutely marvelous presentation and for turning your life to such a lot of good work. It's just amazing to listen to you talk about your own history. I wanted to ask about research on drug gangs and how they affect homelessness and how they affect what you can do with the people who are the victims. Because I didn't hear it in the presentation of, but maybe there's a reason why it has to be kept separate. I don't know.
No, it does. That's an amazing question. In one of the first client focus groups I hosted at this Homeless Foundation, we were trying to figure out what the drivers were. Like, that's how far back this goes. And we brought folks together and like, why do you come to Calgary and to this homeless serving system? And I said, well, honestly, it's the price of drugs that, so it's, we don't like to, and it's not about demonizing or making assumptions, but in parts of the homeless population, drug culture is a huge impact, of course. I did a street culture study with in Edmonton, and like even the way, now this was 10 years ago and it was anthropology, so it's small sample groups, but the way people self-divided in the homeless community was around the types of drugs that they would use. Now that's obviously turned on its head now with the new drugs happening. So your question being, how do we fully understand what the drug economy, the informal economy, and homelessness experience at the frontline level, and how do we intervene in that? Do we have really good research? We don't have very good research on that. I think it's a huge gap. I can tell you how my brother practices his business, and I can tell you that the drug gangs, for instance, in Vancouver, and the way that they manage drug trafficking and victimize vulnerable populations is that's the way they do business. And it's not just drugs, it's prostitution, et cetera. So that informal economy, we've been able to research the crap out of people with lived experience and as victims, but we haven't done a good job of mapping out those relationships. And part of it is, and this is where we need you as researchers, as independent academics in this, because there's a danger factor with that, because those gangs have links into where we don't want to look, right? So.
Yes, because they are wanting the people back.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's the big question with those groups, is how do you help keep these people from getting threatened back, or in whatever way they use to get the people back. Yeah.
Absolutely. There is a function of your informal economy in this system that is very little understood. So that's a great area to look at. And that's a macro-micro view too, and it's goes way back and it's going to continue. So absolutely essential. Thank you for that.
So thanks once again to Dr. Turner. Please join me in a round of applause.